The Meisters of the Citadel would later debate how to record it. The night the sky tore open above the Wolfswood. Some would call it divine intervention. Others, a curse from beyond the known world. But those who survived the coming winter knew the truth. The gods had sent them a monster to fight monsters. The rift appeared without warning, a wound in reality that bled crimson light across the winter sky. It lasted only moments, a thunderclap that shook the ancient trees, a flash that turned night to blood-red day, and then silence. When the small folk of Winter Town emerged from their hovels the next morning, they found something that would make even the hardest northern warrior reach for his sword. A trail of enormous footprints in the snow, each one smoking as if the very earth recoiled from what had walked upon it. The tracks led north, always north, toward the wall, toward the coming darkness, toward a destiny that would intertwine with the fate of every soul in Westeros. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Kratos opened his eyes to cold. Not the cold of Midgard's endless winter, but something different, sharper, hungrier, as if the very air sought to drain the warmth from living things. He pushed himself to his feet, and the snow beneath him hissed and steamed. The blades of chaos hung at his sides, their chains wrapped tight around his scarred forearms. The Leviathan axe remained strapped to his back, humming with barely contained frost magic. This was not Midgard, not Olympus, not any realm he recognized from his centuries of existence. Another world, he muttered, his gravelly voice carrying across the silent forest. The Norn's final jest. He had been traveling with Atreus, his son, Loki, through the realms when the rupture occurred. A surge of chaotic magic, raw and undirected, had torn through the fabric between worlds. Kratos had pushed Atreus clear, but the rift had swallowed him whole, spitting him out. Here, wherever here was. The trees surrounding him were ancient, their branches heavy with snow and ice. Weirwood, though he did not know the name. The faces carved into their pale bark seemed to watch him with blood-red eyes, as if the very forest recognized a killer when it saw one. Kratos had lived long enough to sense when he was being observed by powers beyond mortal understanding. These trees reminded him of the world tree, Yggdrasil but twisted, older perhaps, or simply different. He began walking north because the cold called to something in the Leviathan axe, making the weapon vibrate with recognition, and because in his experience, the greatest threats always lay in the direction no sane man would choose to go. The wolves would stretch for miles, but Kratos covered ground quickly. His pace would have exhausted any mortal man, but he had not been merely mortal in centuries. The Ghost of Sparta, the god of war, the destroyer of Olympus. The titles meant nothing here in this place where the very air tasted wrong, where magic felt different, thinner, wilder, less structured than the divine power he knew. He had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when he heard the screams. Kratos stopped, head tilting slightly. His warrior's instincts, honed across countless battlefields and divine wars, parsed the sounds with practiced efficiency. Men, 6, perhaps 7, dying badly, and something else, a wet, guttural growling that spoke of hunger and mindless violence. He did not run toward the screams. Kratos had learned, painfully, that rushing blindly into conflict often created more problems than it solved. But he moved with purpose, his footfalls silent despite his considerable size, the blades of chaos beginning to smoke as battle readiness flooded his veins. The clearing opened before him, and Kratos took in the scene with a single, comprehensive glance. 7 men in dark furs and leathers, bandits or deserters by the look of them, were being torn apart by creatures that defied easy categorization. They looked like men, or had been men once, but something had gone terribly wrong. Their skin was pale as the snow stretched tight over skeletal frames. Their eyes burned with an eerie blue light, and their movements possessed an unnatural, jerking quality that reminded Kratos of the Draugr he had faced in Midgard. But these were not Draugr. The cold radiating from them was different, absolute, existential, as if they were avatars of winter itself. One of the pale creatures buried its fingers into a screaming man's chest and simply pulled. The bandit's ribcage came apart with a wet crack, and his screams cut off abruptly. The creature raised its prize, the man's still beating heart, and crushed it between its fingers with casual indifference. Wights, though Kratos did not know the name, he recognized death-animated flesh when he saw it. The last surviving bandit, a grizzled man with a sword and more courage than sense, charged the nearest wight with a desperate battle cry. His blade struck true, piercing the creature's torso, but the wight simply looked down at the embedded weapon as if puzzled by it. Then its hand shot out, fingers closing around the man's throat with crushing force. Kratos moved. The Leviathan axe left his hand in a blur of motion, spinning end over end through the frigid air. It struck the wight holding the bandit with enough force to sever its arm at the elbow, and the creature released its grip with an almost questioning tilt of its head. The bandit collapsed, gasping, as the axe continued its arc and buried itself in a tree trunk 20 feet away. Every wight in the clearing turned toward Kratos. For a moment, silence reigned. The creatures regarded him with those burning blue eyes, and Kratos stared back without fear or hesitation. He had faced the gods of Olympus. He had fought Thor, the god of thunder. He had killed Zeus himself. These animated corpses, however strange and unsettling, were merely another obstacle to overcome. "Come," Kratos said simply. The wights rushed him as one, moving with that unnatural, jerking speed. Kratos' hand shot out, and the Leviathan axe tore free from the tree and flew back to his grip, obeying the magic bound into its handle. He swung in a devastating arc, and frost magic erupted from the blade. The nearest wight shattered like glass, frozen solid and destroyed in a single blow. The blades of chaos came alive in his other hand, wreathed in eternal flame. Where the axe froze, the blades burned. Fire and ice, destruction balanced between extremes. The chains sang as he spun, decades of muscle memory guiding his strikes with brutal efficiency. A wight lunged for his throat. Kratos drove a blade through its chest and wrenched sideways, tearing the creature in half. Another came from his blind side. He shattered its skull with the axe, frost spreading across its pale flesh in crackling patterns. The surviving bandit watched in stunned silence as this stranger, this mountain of scarred muscle and controlled violence, dismantled the wights with mechanical precision. No wasted movement, no fear, just overwhelming, terrible competence born from centuries of war. The last wight fell with its head separated from its body, and Kratos stood amid the carnage, breathing steadily, not even winded. The bodies of the pale creatures were already beginning to decay at an accelerated rate, as if whatever dark magic had animated them was fleeing back to its source. The bandit, survivor now, witness to something he had no framework to understand, pushed himself to his feet. His hands trembled as he retrieved his sword, though he made no move to attack. Smart man. Kratos could see the calculation in his eyes. Fight this demon warrior and die, or live to speak of what he'd seen. What are you?" the man croaked, his northern accent thick with shock. Kratos studied him for a long moment. The man wore furs and leather armor that spoke of pragmatic violence rather than noble birth. A deserter from someone's army, most likely, turned to banditry when the alternative was starvation or execution. Kratos had known many such men, had been such a man once, before the gods had elevated him and damned him in equal measure. "I am," Kratos paused, considering his answer. In truth, he did not know what he was anymore. Not fully god, not fully man. A father certainly, though his son was now beyond his reach. A warrior always, far from home. The bandit's eyes dropped to the blades of chaos, still smoking with residual heat, the chains disappearing into Kratos' scarred forearms where they had been permanently bound by Ares so long ago. Those things, we call them wights, dead men walking, servants of the Night King and the White Walkers. He spat into the blood-soaked snow. You killed them like they were nothing, like cutting wheat. They died easily enough, Kratos replied. What are White Walkers? The man's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. The end of everything if the old stories are true. Ice demons from beyond the wall bringing winter that never ends. But that's... He stopped, looking at the decaying wights, at the impossible warrior standing before him. That's supposed to be legend. Children's tales to make them behave. Kratos felt a familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. Of course. He had been pulled from one apocalypse only to land in the midst of another. The gods, whatever gods ruled this strange place, had a sense of humor as cruel as those he had known. Where is the nearest settlement? Kratos asked. The bandit pointed south with a shaking hand. Winterfell, seat of House Stark, Wardens of the North. 2 days' march for normal men. Maybe 1 for, he trailed off, unable to find words for what Kratos was. Stark, Kratos repeated, committing the name to memory. These White Walkers, they come from the north. Beyond the wall, 700 feet of ice, magic worked into every stone built to keep them out. But if whites are this far south, the man's voice dropped to a whisper. The wall might have fallen, or be falling. We're all dead if that's true. Kratos looked north, toward the source of the unnatural cold. He could feel it now, a vast and terrible presence pressing against the world like a weight upon the shoulders of reality itself. Something ancient and hungry, patient as ice, inexorable as winter. He had felt such presences before, in the darkest pits of Tartarus, in the halls of Helheim, in the spaces between worlds where nightmares took form and fed on fear. You will go to this Winterfell, Kratos said, turning back to the bandit. Tell whoever leads there that something worse than whites walks south through these woods. Tell them, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell them the Ghost of Sparta has arrived, and I have killed gods before. The bandit stared at him, uncomprehending but obedient. Survival instinct, Kratos recognized, the knowledge that arguing with this being would be fatal. The man gathered what remained of his courage and fled south, crashing through the underbrush with none of the stealth he'd likely relied upon as a bandit. Kratos watched him go, then retrieved the Leviathan axe and began walking north, toward the cold, toward the darkness that even these hardened Northmen feared. Atreus would want him to help these people. His son had always possessed a gentler heart, a capacity for compassion that Kratos had lost and was only now, in his twilight years, beginning to rediscover. And perhaps, if he saved this world from its winter apocalypse, whatever magic had brought him here might also provide a path home. Or perhaps he would simply do what he had always done, fight the monsters, break the chains of fate, and rage against the dying of the light. The Ghost of Sparta had come to Westeros, and Winter would soon learn what happened when ancient evils encountered a god-killer who refused to submit to destiny. Behind him, the carved faces in the weirwood trees wept crimson sap, as if the old gods themselves recognized that the game had changed forever. Winterfell rose from the winter landscape like a promise carved in stone, ancient, enduring, defiant against the endless cold. Kratos observed it from the tree line as dawn broke over the castle's gray walls. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys, and even from this distance, he could hear the organized chaos of a fortress preparing for war. The clang of steel on steel from the training yards, the shouted commands of officers drilling troops, the rumble of supply wagons being loaded and unloaded. These people knew the threat was coming. They simply did not know what it truly meant. Kratos had spent the night traveling, covering ground that would have taken ordinary men days. He had encountered 3 more groups of whites, each larger than the last, and each had fallen to his blades with the same mechanical efficiency. But what troubled him was the pattern. The creatures were moving with purpose, not randomly wandering. Something was directing them, coordinating their advance, an intelligence behind the mindless hunger. He had faced such enemies before. Hive minds, dark gods commanding legions of corrupted servants. The principle was always the same: find the source, kill it, watch the army crumble. Simple, brutal, effective. But first, he needed information about this world and its powers. And the bandit's words had pointed him here, to this seat of northern authority. Kratos emerged from the forest and walked openly toward Winterfell's main gate. No stealth, no deception. He had learned that approaching fortresses with obvious hostile intent only complicated matters. Better to be direct, let them make the first move, and respond accordingly. The guards on the wall noticed him immediately. Kratos heard the shouts of alarm, saw men scrambling for weapons and forming ranks. By the time he reached the outer gate, 20 soldiers stood in formation, spears leveled, while archers on the walls above drew their bows with practiced precision. A tall man in fine furs and armor stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of a longsword. His face was weathered by northern winds, his eyes sharp with the intelligence of a seasoned commander. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, and his bearing spoke of nobility tempered by hard pragmatism. "That's close enough, stranger," the man called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "State your name and business, or turn back the way you came." Kratos stopped 10 paces from the gate, making no move toward his weapons. "I am Kratos. I seek the leaders of this place. There are things they must know about what comes from the north." The nobleman's eyes narrowed, scanning Kratos from head to toe, taking in the ashen skin, the red tattoo, the mass of scar tissue that covered almost every visible inch of flesh, the exotic weapons strapped to his frame. "Kratos, that's no northern name. Where do you hail from?" "Somewhere very far away," Kratos replied evenly. "Your people call the enemy White Walkers. I have killed 36 of their servants since arriving in your lands. The attacks are becoming more organized, more frequent. The threat is accelerating." Murmurs rippled through the assembled soldiers. The nobleman raised a hand for silence, his expression darkening. "You claim to have killed wights. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe. They don't die easily. Dragonglass or Valyrian steel, those are the only things that can." Kratos' hand moved in a blur. The Leviathan axe came off his back and flew through the air, embedding itself in the wooden gate with a thunderous impact that shook the entire structure. Frost spread across the wood in crystalline patterns, and several guards stumbled backward in shock. The nobleman's sword was halfway out of its scabbard before he registered what had happened. The axe had been thrown with enough force to punch through solid oak, and now it hung there, humming with barely contained magical energy, frost continuing to spread in delicate, deadly patterns. Kratos extended his hand. The axe tore free and flew back to his grip, obeying the ancient magic bound into its construction. He caught it effortlessly and returned it to his back, never breaking eye contact with the nobleman. "I do not die easily either," Kratos said simply. "And I have little patience for debate while your enemy grows stronger. You will take me to your lord, or I will find him myself." The nobleman stared at him for a long moment, hand still on his sword, clearly calculating odds and outcomes. Finally, he relaxed slightly, not trusting but accepting the reality of the situation. "I am Jon Snow, king in the north and warden of Winterfell. If you truly want to speak with the leadership of the north, you're looking at him." A king. Kratos studied Jon Snow with a fresh assessment. The man was younger than most rulers Kratos had encountered, perhaps 30 years, with the bearing of someone who had been thrust into command by circumstance rather than birth. There was steel in him, though, and the kind of wary competence that came from surviving battles that should have killed him. "Then we speak now," Kratos said. "The creatures I have killed are merely scouts, testing your defenses. Whatever commands them will send more, and soon." Jon Snow held his gaze for several heartbeats, then nodded curtly. "Lower your weapons," he commanded his men, "but stay alert." To Kratos, "You'll forgive me if I keep guards present during this conversation. Given recent events, trust is in short supply." "I expect nothing less," Kratos replied. They moved into Winterfell's great hall, a cavernous space dominated by a long table and the warmth of enormous hearths. Several other figures were already present, clearly Jon Snow's war council. Kratos catalogued them with a warrior's practiced eye. A tall woman with striking red hair and sharp, calculating eyes, nobility written in every line of her posture, but with a hardness that spoke of recent trauma. A large, bearded man with the easy confidence of a veteran warrior. A slender woman in leather armor with a sword at her hip and the cold, assessing gaze of an accomplished killer. A maester in gray robes, elderly but alert. And in a wheeled chair near the fire, a thin young man with an otherworldly quality to his expression, as if he saw things beyond normal human perception. "My counsel," Jon said, gesturing to the assembly. "Lady Sansa Stark, my sister and Lady of Winterfell, Sir Davos Seaworth, my hand, Arya Stark, my sister, Maester Walken, and Brandon Stark, the three-eyed raven." The titles meant little to Kratos, but he nodded acknowledgement. These were the powers in this place, the decision-makers. Good, he could work with that. "He calls himself Kratos," Jon continued, addressing his council. "Claims to have been killing wights in the Wolfswood, and he has unusual abilities." He described the axe throw with admirable accuracy. And Kratos saw skepticism, war with pragmatic acceptance, on the faces of the assembled nobles. "Impossible," the Maester Walken muttered. "No man has such strength, unless—" He peered at Kratos with suddenly intense interest. "What manner of being are you? Giant's blood, children of the forest magic, something else entirely?" "I am what was made of me," Kratos said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient pain. "Through war and divine curse. The specifics are unimportant. What matters is that I can kill your enemy." The young man in the wheeled chair, Brandon, spoke for the first time, his voice distant and strange. "He speaks truth. He is not of this world. He fell through a tier between realities, brought here by magic he did not control, and he has killed gods." Those eerie eyes fixed on Kratos with unsettling intensity. "I have seen what you were, what you did, the pantheon you destroyed, the son you lost, the son you found." Kratos' hand tightened on the Leviathan axe, old fury stirring in his chest. This boy, this three-eyed raven, had peered into his history, witnessed his shame and suffering. "Stay out of my mind, child. I have killed seers before." "Brand doesn't mean offense," Jon said quickly, stepping between them with the practiced ease of someone used to preventing conflicts. "His abilities, they're complicated. He sees things. Past, present, potential futures. It's how we've stayed ahead of the Night King's movements." "The Night King," Kratos repeated, latching onto the name. "He commands the White Walkers." "He is the first White Walker," Sansa Stark spoke up, her voice cool and controlled. "Created by the children of the forest 8,000 years ago as a weapon against the first men. But he broke free of their control and has been building his army in the far north ever since. Now he marches south with 100,000 wights and his White Walker lieutenants, and when he reaches the wall—" She paused, emotion flickering across her composed features. "Our world ends in ice and darkness." Kratos had heard similar speeches before, from desperate rulers facing impossible odds, but what struck him was the absolute certainty in her voice. These people truly believed they faced extinction, and from what he had sensed in the northern cold, they might be right. "The wall," he said, "the ice barrier the bandit mentioned." 700 feet of ice and ancient magic, Davos Seaworth explained, his common-born accent a contrast to the noble's refined speech. "Built to keep the White Walkers out. It's held for thousands of years, but intelligence suggests the Night King has acquired something that might breach it. A dragon." "Dead dragon," Arya Stark corrected sharply. "Killed beyond the wall, raised as a white, blue flame that can melt castle walls, if he uses it against the wall." She left the implication unspoken. A dragon, dead and corrupted, serving this Night King. Kratos felt a familiar sensation, the universe's apparent determination to throw increasingly dangerous obstacles in his path. He had fought dragons before, in Greece and in Midgard. One more would make little difference. Then the wall will fall, Kratos said bluntly, and your enemy will march south. How many warriors do you have? Jon's expression darkened. Not enough. Perhaps 40,000 if we can unite all the northern houses, the wildlings and the Knights of the Vale, against 100,000 wights that feel no fear and don't die unless you hit them perfectly. He moved to the great table where a massive map of Westeros was spread out, marked with tokens and notations. We've sent ravens to every major house in the 7 kingdoms, begging for support. Some answered, many didn't. They think it's a northern problem, or worse, think we're lying to gain political advantage. Fools, Kratos said flatly. Winter does not negotiate borders. No, Sansa agreed, a bitter smile crossing her face. It doesn't, but tell that to Cersei Lannister, who sits on the Iron Throne and plays her games while the world dies. Kratos studied the map, parsing the geography with a tactician's eye. He had commanded armies across multiple realms, fought wars on scales these people could barely imagine. The strategic situation was grim but not impossible if certain variables could be controlled. This Night King, he said, he is the source, the intelligence directing the wights. If he falls, what happens to his army? Brandon's strange eyes fixed on him again. They fall too, all of them. He's the center of the web, the anchor for the magic that animates the dead. Kill him and the threat ends. Then the solution is obvious, Kratos replied. I will go north and kill him. Silence descended on the hall. The council members exchanged glances that mixed hope with disbelief. Just like that? Arya asked, her assassin's skepticism evident. You'll just walk beyond the wall, find the Night King and his army of 100,000 wights and a dozen White Walkers, and kill him. Yes. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most arrogant, she said, a hint of respect creeping into her voice. Probably both. Jon shook his head slowly. Even if you could reach him, and I'm not saying you could, the Night King isn't just some white commander. He's ancient, powerful beyond measure, and has magic we barely understand. He can raise entire battlefields of the dead with a gesture. He turned a dragon into his servant. Men who have fought him say his touch brings instant death, freezing flesh in seconds. I have fought worse, Kratos said simply, and it was true. Zeus's lightning, Thor's hammer, Baldur's invulnerability. He had overcome them all through persistence, strategy, and overwhelming violence. This Night King, however powerful, was still bound by physical form, and anything with physical form could be destroyed. You don't understand, Davos interjected. This isn't about individual courage or strength, the logistics alone. I understand perfectly, Kratos interrupted. You plan to gather your armies, make your stand at this wall or perhaps at this fortress, and hope that superior tactics and discipline can overcome numerical disadvantage. You will sacrifice thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, and still might fail because the enemy can replenish his ranks with your dead. He turned back to Jon. I offer a different approach. I will kill the source directly. Your armies defend, hold ground, buy time. I will end the threat. And if you fail, Sansa asked quietly. Kratos met her gaze. Then your situation is no worse than it already was, but I will not fail. I have toppled pantheons. I have broken the chains of fate itself. This Night King is powerful, but he is not a god, not truly. And even if he were, the ghost of a terrible smile crossed his scarred face. I have killed gods before. Brandon spoke again, his voice hollow and certain. He means it, I can see possibilities. Futures where he walks into the storm of ice and emerges victorious, and futures where he falls, broken on the frozen ground. The threads are unclear, but he is not lying. He believes he can win, and belief in one such as him has power. Even so, Jon said carefully, you'd need to survive getting there first. The lands beyond the wall are a nightmare now. Wights everywhere, White Walkers patrolling, and winter storms that can freeze a man solid in minutes. You'd need. I need nothing, Kratos said. Point me north. Tell me where this Night King can be found. I will handle the rest. More glances were exchanged. Kratos could see the calculation in their eyes, weighing his confidence against their desperation. They wanted to believe him, wanted to hope that this stranger from another world truly was the solution to their apocalypse. But hope, Kratos knew, was dangerous. It made people careless. "If you're serious about this," Jon said slowly, "we could at least provide support. Rangers who know the lands beyond the wall, supplies, dragonglass weapons." "Keep your men," Kratos replied. "They would only slow me down or die trying to keep up. Dragonglass is unnecessary. My weapons are sufficient. As for supplies," he gestured to his sparse equipment, "I have survived in harsher conditions than your winter. I will be fine." Arya stepped forward, studying him with the intensity of a fellow predator recognizing its kind. "You really think you're that much better than us? That you can do alone what armies can't?" Kratos looked at her, this young woman who carried death in her eyes and a sword at her hip, who had clearly seen and done terrible things in her short life. He recognized that look. He had worn it himself once in the earliest days after Ares had made him the Ghost of Sparta. "I do not think," he said quietly. "I know, because I have walked through armies alone before. I have fought battles that would break your understanding of what is possible. This is what I am, child. This is what was made of me." He paused, then added with unusual gentleness, "But I also know that confidence born from ignorance dies quickly. So I will accept one thing: information. Maps, if you have them. Intelligence on the Night King's location and movements. Knowledge of the terrain. These things will make the hunt more efficient." Jon nodded slowly, relief evident on his face. "That we can provide. Meister Walken bring the northern maps and the latest reports from our scouts. Bran, can you see where the Night King is now?" Brandon's eyes rolled back, showing only white, and for a moment his body went rigid. When he returned, there was a strange mix of awe and terror in his expression. "He's at Hardhome, rallying his forces. The wall still stands, but he prepares to march on it within 3 days. The dead dragon," he shuddered. "It waits with him, hungry for living flesh and fire that no longer warms." 3 days, Kratos said. "Then I have time. Show me these maps. Tell me what you know of his powers and weaknesses. And then—" He turned toward the northern wall of the hall as if he could already see through stone and distance to the enemy beyond. "Then I will go hunting." As Meister Walken hurried to gather the requested materials, Davos moved closer to Jon and spoke in a low voice that nonetheless carried to Kratos' enhanced hearing. "You truly believe him, your grace? Can he do this alone?" Jon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Kratos. "I don't know, but I've learned to recognize truth when I hear it and desperation when I feel it. He believes he can win. And right now, Davos, I'll take that over the certainty that we're all going to die." Sansa joined them, her voice equally low. "If he fails, he dies in the frozen wastes and we never know. But if he succeeds—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "If he succeeds," Arya finished for her, "we need to figure out what having a god-killer in Westeros means for the rest of us. Because the Night King isn't the only monster in this world. And something tells me Kratos doesn't distinguish much between the threats he kills." She was right, of course. Kratos had heard her, knew they were already planning for the possibility that he might become a problem after solving their immediate crisis. Smart. He would have done the same. Leaders who didn't plan for every contingency rarely remained leaders for long. But that was a problem for later. For now, there was only the mission. Find the Night King, kill him, end the threat. Simple, direct, the way Kratos preferred his wars. The Ghost of Sparta had come to Westeros, and Winter's king was about to learn what happened when immortal evil met eternal rage. The journey beyond the wall took Kratos 2 days of relentless northern travel. He had left Winterfell with maps, intelligence, and the wary respect of Jon Snow's council. They had wanted to send rangers with him, scouts who knew the terrain and could guide him through the worst of the frozen wastes. Kratos had refused. He traveled faster alone, and the cold that would kill ordinary men in hours was merely uncomfortable to him. The wall itself had been impressive, a monument to desperate necessity, its ice-blue surface climbing toward the sky like a frozen wave caught in the moment before breaking. Ancient magic pulsed within it, wards and protections woven by long-dead sorcerers. Kratos could feel them humming against his skin as he passed through the tunnel at Castle Black, where grim-faced rangers watched him go with expressions that mixed hope and certainty that they would never see him again. Beyond the wall, the true north began, a wasteland of ice and snow, dotted with frozen forests and dead villages. The temperature plummeted to levels that would have meant instant death for anyone not protected by divine heritage or magical constitution. Kratos' breath formed great clouds of vapor, and frost formed on his beard and eyebrows, but he pressed on without slowing. And everywhere there were bodies. Wights roamed in packs, dozens strong, mindlessly patrolling through the wastes. Kratos killed them when they crossed his path, but he didn't hunt them systematically. They were symptoms, not the disease. Every moment spent destroying the animated dead was a moment not spent reaching their master. The Leviathan axe and the blades of chaos made the work efficient. Fire and ice, the fundamental extremes, proved equally effective against creatures that were neither truly alive nor properly dead. But as he moved deeper into the Night King's territory, Kratos began to notice changes in his enemies. The wights grew more coordinated. They set ambushes, used terrain to their advantage, even employed rudimentary tactics that suggested direct control from a greater intelligence. And among them, Kratos began to encounter the White Walkers themselves. The first one appeared on the evening of his first day beyond the wall. Kratos had been cutting through a pack of wights in a ruined village when the temperature dropped even further, and the animated corpses suddenly retreated, forming a semicircle around him with unusual discipline. The White Walker strode into the clearing like winter-given form, taller than a man, impossibly thin, with skin like ice and eyes that burned with cold blue fire. It wore ancient armor that might once have been black but was now covered in frost and ice, and in its hand it carried a blade of crystalline material that radiated supernatural cold. For a moment, the White Walker and Kratos studied each other across the blood-stained snow. The creature tilted its head with an almost curious expression, as if encountering something it didn't quite understand. Then it raised its ice blade and attacked. The White Walker moved with preternatural speed, its blade whistling through the air in strikes that left trails of frost. But Kratos had fought gods who could shatter mountains and traverse dimensions. Speed alone was not enough. He parried the first strike with the Leviathan axe, and the impact sent a shockwave through the frozen air. The White Walker's eyes widened fractionally, surprise, perhaps, or the closest thing to that emotion it could still feel. It pressed the attack, blade work displaying centuries of martial skill, each strike aimed at vital points with mechanical precision. Kratos gave ground for 3 exchanges, analyzing his opponent's patterns and capabilities. The White Walker was fast, skilled, and its blade radiated a cold that could shatter steel on contact. But it fought with the arrogance of something that had never encountered a worthy opponent, something accustomed to overwhelming mortals through sheer supernatural advantage. On the 4th exchange, Kratos stopped retreating. The blades of chaos came alive in his left hand, chains rattling as eternal fire blazed along the weapon's length. He caught the White Walker's blade between the crossed chains and wrenched sideways, throwing the creature off balance. Before it could recover, the Leviathan axe struck its torso with devastating force, frost magic meeting supernatural ice in an explosion of crystalline fragments. The White Walker shattered like glass, its body exploding into 1,000 pieces that dissolved into mist before hitting the ground. Around the clearing, every wight it had been controlling collapsed simultaneously, inanimate once more. Kratos stood amid the carnage, breathing steadily, and felt the weight of observation upon him. Something was watching, something vast and cold and patient. The Night King, perhaps, observes through the eyes of his servants, learning about this new variable in his calculations. Good, let him watch. Let him see what was coming for him. The encounters increased in frequency as Kratos pushed north. More White Walkers, leading larger forces of wights, employing increasingly sophisticated tactics. They tried to overwhelm him with numbers. They tried to trap him in narrow ravines where their ice weapons could strike from multiple angles. They even tried to use the terrain against him, leading him onto frozen lakes and attempting to break the ice beneath his feet. All of it failed. Kratos had spent centuries fighting impossible odds. These creatures, however ancient and powerful by mortal standards, were merely another obstacle. He destroyed them with methodical efficiency, leaving a trail of shattered ice and fallen wights in his wake. By the second night, he reached Hardhome. The settlement had once been a thriving wildling community, thousands of free folk living beyond the reach of southern kings. Now it was a monument to death. Frozen corpses littered the ground, thousands of them, and at the center of the devastation stood an army that defied comprehension. 100,000 wights, maybe more, packed so densely that the ground itself seemed to writhe with undead movement. And above them, circling on massive wings, the dragon. Kratos had fought dragons before, but this thing was an abomination. It had been magnificent once. He could see that in the lines of its body, the span of its wings. But death and the Night King's magic had twisted it into something wrong. Its scales were pale as ice. Its eyes burned with that same cold blue fire, and when it opened its jaws, blue flame poured forth. Not the natural dragon fire of living beasts, but something colder, more terrible. Flame that burned with winter's chill and froze whatever it touched. And at the heart of the army, standing on a raised mound of frozen earth, the Night King waited. He was taller than his White Walker servants, his armor more ornate. His crown of ice-formed horns catching what little light filtered through the perpetual storm clouds. But it was his eyes that marked him as different. They held intelligence, awareness, and something that might have been amusement as he watched Kratos approach the edge of his vast army. Kratos stopped at the perimeter, perhaps 50 yards from the nearest wights. The entire army had gone still, 100,000 animated corpses frozen in place like a macabre sculpture garden. The only movement came from the dragon, still circling overhead, and the Night King himself, who raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of greeting or challenge. "You are the source," Kratos called out, his voice carrying across the frozen wastes. "The first White Walker, the one who commands this army." The Night King didn't speak, couldn't speak perhaps, or simply chose not to. But he inclined his head in acknowledgement, and the gesture carried a weight of ancient power and infinite patience. "I am Kratos, the Ghost of Sparta. I have killed gods and titans. I have toppled pantheons and broken the chains of fate itself." Kratos' hands moved to his weapons, the Leviathan axe sliding from his back, the blades of chaos igniting with eternal flame. "I have come to end you." For a long moment, nothing happened. The Night King simply stared at him, those burning blue eyes utterly unreadable. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth quirked upward in something that might have been a smile. He raised both hands, and the army came alive. The wights surged forward as one, a tidal wave of undead flesh and frozen rage. They came from all sides, thousands upon thousands, and the dragon swooped down from above with a roar that shook the very air, blue flames gathering in its throat. Kratos had faced armies before. He had stood alone against the forces of Olympus, against the legions of hell, against the Valkyries themselves. This was no different, just another impossible battle, another test of his endurance and skill and endless rage. The Spartan rage awakened within him, that ancient fury that had been his constant companion since Ares had taken everything from him, that burning core of violence and pain that had carried him through centuries of war. His skin began to glow with a dull red light, and when he roared his challenge to the advancing horde, it was a sound of pure primal fury that echoed across the frozen wastes. Then he charged. The first wave of wights broke against him like water against stone. The blades of chaos became a whirlwind of fire and death, each strike incinerating multiple enemies, each chain whip of the weapons cutting through ranks of undead with brutal efficiency. The Leviathan axe sang through the air, shattering frozen bodies and sending enemies flying backward into their comrades. But there were so many. For every wight Kratos destroyed, 3 more took its place. They climbed over the bodies of the fallen, pressing forward with mindless determination, hands grasping, jaws snapping, eyes burning with unnatural light. The dragon dove, and Kratos dove with it, not away, but toward. The creature's blue flames washed over the space where he had been standing, freezing hundreds of wights solid in an instant. But Kratos was already moving, using the frozen corpses as platforms, leaping upward with God-born strength to meet the dragon mid-flight. The Leviathan axe left his hand, spinning through the air to strike the dragon's wing joint. The weapon's frost magic clashed with the creature's supernatural cold, and for a moment the dragon faltered, its wing spasming. Kratos recalled the axe and threw it again, this time aiming for the creature's throat. The dragon twisted, avoiding the strike by inches, and responded with another gout of blue flame. Kratos couldn't dodge completely, the flames caught his left side, and even with his divine resilience, the cold burned like nothing he had experienced. Worse than hell's ice, worse than the Leviathan's depths. This was cold that reached beyond flesh, that sought to freeze the very spirit. Kratos roared in pain and fury, and the Spartan rage intensified. His skin glowed brighter, red meeting blue, rage and ancient fury pushing back against the killing frost. He couldn't let himself be pinned down, couldn't let the dragon control the engagement while the wights overwhelmed him from below. So he did something insane, even by his standards. As the dragon circled for another pass, Kratos waited until it was directly overhead, then hurled the Leviathan axe not at the creature, but at the ground. The impact released a massive explosion of frost magic, flash freezing a 20-foot radius of white solid. Kratos used the momentary clearing to build momentum, then leaped. Not a normal leap, but the kind of vertical jump that only beings with divine strength could achieve. 50 feet, 60, 70. He soared through the air like a missile, arms outstretched, chains of the blades of chaos trailing fire behind him. He caught the dragon's tail as it passed overhead. The creature shrieked, a sound of rage and surprise, and bucked wildly, trying to throw him off. But Kratos had held onto the Titan Kronos as the ancient being tried to crush him, and had ridden the back of Poseidon's hippocampi through raging seas. A dead dragon, however large, would not throw him. He climbed, hand over hand, the blade's chains wrapped around the dragon's spine for purchase. Below, the battle continued. The wights had stopped their advance, perhaps awaiting commands, while the White Walkers watched their master's prize servant struggle with this impossible intruder. The dragon rolled, trying to scrape Kratos off against the frozen ground, but he held on. It climbed, trying to freeze him with altitude and thin air, but he did not need to breathe as mortals did. It dove, attempting to slam him against ice formations, but he anticipated each maneuver. Finally, Kratos reached the base of the dragon's skull. The blades of chaos drove into the creature's neck with savage force, eternal fire meeting undead ice in an explosion of steam and corrupted magic. The dragon screamed, and the sound held genuine pain, perhaps the first it had felt since death had claimed it. Kratos wrenched the blades sideways, cutting deep, seeking the spine. Black ichor poured from the wound, freezing solid before it hit the ground far below. The dragon's flight became erratic, one wing barely responding. It was dying, truly dying this time, the magic that animated it unraveling under the assault of weapons that had killed beings far greater than it. With a final, desperate effort, the dragon rolled completely inverted, and dove toward the ground at suicidal speed. Kratos understood the tactic immediately. It would crash, hopping to crush him in the impact, sacrificing itself to eliminate the threat. He respected the strategy, but it wouldn't work. At the last possible moment before impact, Kratos tore the blades free and kicked off from the dragon's head, launching himself clear. Behind him, the great beast struck the frozen earth with catastrophic force, its body shattering into massive chunks of ice and corrupted flesh. The impact sent shockwaves rippling across Hardhome, and several dozen wights were crushed beneath falling debris. Kratos landed in a crouch amid the army of the dead, breathing hard but still very much alive. Around him, the wights had formed a loose circle, keeping their distance, perhaps finally recognizing him as a genuine threat. And approaching through that circle, flanked by his White Walker lieutenants, came the Night King himself. The ancient being moved with eerie grace, his ice blade held loosely in one hand. As he walked, the wights parted before him like a sea, and the temperature dropped even further. Frost formed on Kratos' weapons, on his skin and his beard and hair. The Night King radiated cold like a furnace radiated heat, absolute, existential, the cold of entropy and the heat death of universes. They stood perhaps 10 feet apart, God-killer and Winter's king, and studied each other in silence. The Night King raised his blade slowly, deliberately, a formal challenge. Around them, the army of the dead went utterly still, 100,000 spectators to a duel that would determine the fate of Westeros. Kratos rolled his shoulders, feeling muscles torn and burned during the dragon fight begin to heal, his divine constitution already repairing damage that would have crippled any mortal. The Spartan rage still burned within him, ready to be called upon, but he held it in reserve. This enemy deserved his full attention, his complete focus. "Come then," Kratos said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying in the unnatural stillness. "Show me why they fear you." The Night King's smile widened, and for the first time he moved with true speed. The duel that followed would have been invisible to mortal eyes. Two beings of immense power, one born from war and divine curse, the other created as the ultimate weapon against humanity, clashed in a battle that sent shockwaves across the frozen landscape. The Night King's ice blade struck like winter lightning, each blow calculated to freeze and shatter. Kratos parried with axe and chains, fire meeting ice in explosions of steam and raw magic. They moved across the battlefield, their fight taking them through ranks of stationary wights that were crushed or frozen or incinerated by the backlash of their master's conflict. The Night King was fast, faster than any White Walker, faster than most gods Kratos had fought. His blade work was flawless, refined over 8,000 years of existence, and his touch carried death, each contact with Kratos' skin leaving patches of blackened, frozen flesh that took precious seconds to heal. But Kratos was rage incarnate, fury given form and purpose. Every wound only fed the anger, every setback only made him more dangerous. He had learned long ago that the only way to defeat impossible enemies was to simply refuse to die, to keep fighting long after any sane being would have submitted to fate. The Night King thrust for Kratos' heart. Kratos twisted, taking the blade through his shoulder instead, and used the moment of contact to drive a blade of chaos into the Night King's torso. Eternal fire blazed against supernatural ice, and the Night King's expression flickered, pain perhaps, or something close to it. They broke apart, both breathing hard, though the Night King's breath came as clouds of killing frost. Around them, the battlefield had been transformed into a hellscape of melted ice and frozen fire, white corpses destroyed by the mere proximity of their duel. The Night King raised his free hand, and Kratos felt the air itself freeze solid around him, ice forming on his skin in thick layers, trying to encase him in a tomb of crystalline death. But the Spartan rage exploded outward, red light blazing like a small sun, and the ice shattered into glittering fragments. Kratos charged, roaring, and the Night King met him head-on. Axe against ice blade, fire against winter, two unstoppable forces colliding with reality-shaking impact. The very ground beneath them began to crack and splinter, unable to withstand the forces being unleashed. And slowly, gradually, Kratos began to gain the advantage. Not through superior speed or skill, the Night King matched him in both, but through sheer, bloody-minded determination. Every wound the Night King inflicted healed, slowly but surely. Every moment of advantage the ancient being gained was ground back through Kratos' relentless assault. The Ghost of Sparta had fought battles of attrition against immortals before. He knew how to turn endurance into victory. The Night King seemed to realize this. His expression shifted, that faint smile fading, replaced by something that might have been concern. He gestured sharply, and the White Walker lieutenants moved to intervene, their ice blades raised. Kratos saw them coming and made a split-second decision. He released his grip on the Leviathan axe, leaving it embedded in the ground, and seized the Night King with both hands. The touch of Winter's king burned worse than any flame, worse than Zeus's lightning, freezing Kratos' palms down to the bone. But he held on. "You die alone," Kratos growled through teeth clenched against the agony, "like all tyrants before you." He drove his forehead into the Night King's face with bone-shattering force, then followed with a knee to the ancient being's midsection. The Night King staggered, and in that moment of weakness, Kratos recalled the Leviathan axe. The weapon tore free from the frozen ground and flew into his hand, and Kratos brought it down in a devastating overhead strike that caught the Night King across the shoulder and chest. Frost magic and divine fury combined in the blow, and the Night King's armor cracked, ancient ice shattering under the assault. The Night King stumbled backward, and for the first time, true alarm showed in his burning blue eyes. He raised a hand, perhaps to summon more power, to call down winter itself upon this impossible enemy. Kratos didn't give him the chance. The blades of chaos wrapped around the Night King's extended arm, chains binding tight, eternal fire scorching undead flesh. Kratos pulled, dragging the ancient being toward him, and drove the Leviathan axe directly into his chest. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The Night King stared down at the weapon embedded in his torso, surprise and something that might have been respect in his expression. Then the frost magic activated, spreading from the wound throughout his entire body, competing with the cold magic that animated him. The Night King tried to speak, the first sound Kratos had heard from him, but only a whistling shriek emerged, like wind through ice caverns. His body began to crack. Frost lines spreading across his skin like lightning, and the blue fire in his eyes flickered. Kratos twisted the axe and pulled it free, then brought both blades of chaos down in a final, executioner's strike that severed the Night King's head from his body. The ancient being fell, and the world held its breath. Then, like a wave spreading outward from ground zero, every White Walker in the Night King's army shattered simultaneously. They exploded into crystalline fragments, their existence tied to their creator, and with his death, their magic failed catastrophically. And with the White Walkers gone, the wights collapsed. 100,000 animated corpses fell as one, puppet strings cut, returning to the simple death they should have found long ago. Silence descended on Hardhome. The only sound was the whisper of wind across frozen wastes and Kratos' labored breathing as he stood amid the carnage, the Night King's head held in his frostbitten hand. Winter's king was dead. The army of the dead had fallen, and the Ghost of Sparta had claimed another impossible victory. But as Kratos stood there, surrounded by more corpses than he could count, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion and the familiar weight of being the last one standing on a battlefield of the fallen. "Boy," he said quietly, addressing his absent son across the gulf between worlds, "I wish you could have seen this. You would have found meaning in it, purpose." He looked down at the Night King's severed head, at the extinguished fires where eyes had burned with ancient malevolence. All I see is another monster that needed killing. He dropped his head and turned south, toward Winterfell, toward the living who would need to know that the threat had ended, toward whatever came next in this strange world that was not his home. Behind him, the frozen wastes began to thaw for the first time in 8,000 years. Winter's grip was broken, and a new legend had been born in the north, the Ghost of Sparta, the god-killer who had saved Westeros from eternal darkness. Word of the Night King's death reached Winterfell before Kratos did. Ravens flew south from Castle Black, carrying reports from rangers who had witnessed the impossible, the sudden collapse of every wight within 100 miles of the wall, the shattering of white walkers into crystalline dust, and the inexplicable warming of the far north. Some claim to have felt it in their bones, a fundamental shift in the world's balance, as if winter itself had exhaled its final breath and retreated into legend. By the time Kratos walked through Winterfell's gates 3 days after the battle at Hardhome, the castle courtyard was packed with soldiers, nobles, and small folk who had heard whispers of the stranger who had ended the long night before it could truly begin. They parted before him in awed silence, taking in his battered appearance, armor scorched and frozen in equal measure, skin marked with frostbite that was slowly healing, and in his hand, carried almost casually, the severed head of Winter's king. Jon Snow waited at the top of the steps to the great hall, his council assembled behind him. The king in the north looked as if he hadn't slept in days, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and disbelief. When Kratos reached the top of the steps and placed the Night King's head at Jon's feet, the young king stared at it for a long moment before looking up at the god-killer. "Is it truly over?" Jon asked, his voice rough with emotion he was barely containing. "The source is dead," Kratos replied simply. "The army has fallen, your winter has ended." A sound rippled through the assembled crowd, not quite a cheer, not quite a sob, but something in between. Relief mixed with disbelief, joy tempered by the knowledge that they had come so close to annihilation. Sansa Stark pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Davos Seaworth sank to one knee, whether from exhaustion or prayer, Kratos couldn't tell. Even Arya, the cold-eyed assassin, looked shaken, her hand trembling slightly on her sword hilt. Only Brandon remained unchanged, his eerie gaze fixed on Kratos with that unsettling intensity. "The threads have changed," he said in his distant voice. "Certain futures have become uncertain. Possibilities that didn't exist now bloom like flowers in spring. You have broken fate itself, Ghost of Sparta. The question now is, what will grow in the space you've created?" Before Kratos could respond, Jon stepped forward and did something unexpected. He embraced the god-killer, arms wrapping around Kratos' armored shoulders in a gesture of pure, overwhelming gratitude. "You saved us," Jon said, his voice breaking. "You saved everyone. The North, the South, all of Westeros. How can we ever?" "You cannot," Kratos said, not unkindly, as he gently extracted himself from the embrace. Physical affection still made him uncomfortable, even after all these years. "And I did not do this for gratitude. I did it because it needed to be done. Because I am," he paused, searching for words, "because I am trying to be better than what I was made to be." The words surprised him even as he spoke them. When had that become his motivation? When had the Ghost of Sparta, who had once destroyed civilizations in his rage, begun to care about being better? Perhaps it was Atreus's influence, his son's gentle insistence that strength should be used to protect, not just to destroy. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of centuries finally teaching him something about the cost of endless violence. "Nevertheless," Sansa said, stepping forward with the composure of a true lady despite her tear-stained face, "Winterfell owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Name anything within our power to give, and it's yours. Lands, titles, gold." "I need none of those things," Kratos interrupted. "What I need is information. I am not of this world. I was brought here by magic I did not control, torn from my home and my son. If there is anyone in your lands who understands the barriers between worlds, who might know how to return me to where I belong, direct me to them." A heavy silence fell over the council. Glances were exchanged, and Kratos could read the concern in their expressions. They had grown comfortable, in the space of 3 days, with the idea of having a god-killer in their world. The prospect of his leaving clearly disturbed them less than what his departure might mean for their future conflicts. "There are practitioners of magic in Westeros," Meister Walken said carefully, his scholarly tone measured. "But nothing like what you describe. The Citadel has records of the old magics, but most were lost during the doom of Valyria or forgotten over the centuries. The strongest magic users I know of are—" He hesitated. "Well, there's the Red Priests of our lore, who serve the Lord of Light. They've demonstrated abilities that defy natural law. And there are whispers of darker practitioners in the east, in Ashai and beyond the Shadowlands. There's also Daenerys Targaryen," Jon said quietly, and the name seemed to carry weight in the room. "She has dragons, real ones, not the undead thing you fought. And she survived fire, walked out of flames unburned. If anyone in Westeros has a connection to old magic that might help you—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion. "And where is this Daenerys Targaryen?" Kratos asked. "That," Sansa said with carefully controlled neutrality, "is complicated. She was Jon's lover and ally. She came north with her armies and her dragons to fight the White Walkers alongside us. But when you ended the threat before she even arrived, her forces were still marching north from King's Landing. She's currently camped outside our walls with 2 dragons, 20,000 unsullied soldiers, and a great deal of frustration that her grand arrival to save the North became unnecessary." Kratos understood immediately. A queen who had built her identity around being the savior, the breaker of chains, the leader who would rescue Westeros from darkness, had been robbed of her defining moment by a stranger who accomplished alone what she had brought armies to achieve. That kind of wounded pride could be dangerous, especially in someone with power. "She wants to meet you," Jon added. "Has been demanding it actually since the Ravens confirmed the Night King's death. He chose his words carefully. "She's a complicated woman, good-hearted in many ways, genuinely committed to breaking the wheel of oppression and creating a better world, but also convinced of her own destiny, certain that she was meant to save Westeros and rule it afterward. Your presence challenges that certainty." "Then I will meet her," Kratos said simply. "If she knows of magic that might return me home, I will hear it. If not, I will continue searching elsewhere." "Just," Arya spoke up, her assassin's instincts making her blunt. "Be careful, Daenerys has dragons. And she's not used to people who can't be burned or intimidated. She's learned to see threats everywhere, and you're the biggest threat to her plans that has ever existed." Kratos met her eyes, seeing the concern there despite her cold exterior. "I have faced dragons before, and queens, and gods who thought themselves beyond challenge. If she proves hostile, she will learn the same lesson they did." "That's exactly what we're afraid of," Sansa muttered, but she gestured for servants to approach. "At least let us provide you with proper quarters and a meal before you meet with her. You've earned that much, surely, and it will give us time to prepare appropriate diplomatic protocols." What she meant, Kratos understood, was time to try to prevent the meeting from escalating into violence. These people had grown attached to their young dragon queen, despite their wariness. They didn't want to see her destroyed, even if they recognized she might force the issue. Kratos allowed himself to be led to guest quarters, a surprisingly comfortable room with a massive hearth and a bed that could accommodate his considerable frame. Servants brought food and drink, eyeing him with mixtures of fear and awe. He ate mechanically, fueling his body without tasting, his mind already planning for the coming meeting. Dragons. He remembered Fafnir, the great dragon of Midgard, and the brutal battle in the mines. He remembered the dragons of Rhodes that he had ridden to wage war against the Titans. These creatures of Westeros would be different, flesh and blood rather than constructs or cursed beings, but the principles would be the same. Find the weak points, exploit them, win. but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Atreus would have wanted him to try diplomacy first, to seek understanding before resorting to violence. The boy had taught him that not every problem could be solved by killing it, and that sometimes the harder path was the right one. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Arya Stark entered without waiting for permission, moving with the confidence of someone who knew how to pick locks and navigate in shadow. She studied him for a moment, then spoke with characteristic directness. "I want to know how you did it," she said. "I'm not asking for your secrets or your techniques. I just need to understand. How do you kill something that powerful? How do you stand against impossible odds and win?" Kratos regarded her thoughtfully. She reminded him of himself at her age, hungry for strength, desperate to prove herself, carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh. "You train," he said simply, "every day without fail until your body moves without thought. You study your enemy, learn their patterns, and find their weaknesses. And when the time comes—" He paused, remembering 1,000 battlefields, 1,000 victories bought with pain and sacrifice. "You simply refuse to die. You endure beyond the point where any sane being would quit. And eventually, if you're fortunate and skilled and stubborn enough, your enemy falls first." "That's it?" Arya asked, skepticism in her voice. "Just refuse to die?" "It is not as simple as it sounds," Kratos replied. "Most warriors, when pushed beyond their limits, break. They submit to fate, accept death, or go mad from the strain. The difference between survival and failure is often just the willingness to take one more step when everything in you screams to stop." He met her eyes directly. "You have that quality. I can see it in you. You have walked through darkness and emerged harder for it. But remember, strength without purpose is just violence. Make sure you know why you fight, child. That knowledge will sustain you when nothing else can." Arya nodded slowly, processing his words. "Is that why you did it? Killed the Night King? Because you had a purpose?" "I did it because my son would have wanted me to," Kratos said quietly. "And because I am trying to learn that being strong means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, not just destroying what stands in your way." They sat in silence for a moment, warrior to warrior, understanding passing between them without need for further words. Finally, Arya stood and moved toward the door. "Daenerys will see you tomorrow at dawn. She wants the meeting to be outside the walls where her dragons can be present. Jon's going with you, and so am I, just in case things go bad." "They will not," Kratos said with certainty. "I did not save this world from one tyrant only to destroy it fighting another." "Let's hope Daenerys sees it that way," Arya replied, and slipped out as silently as she'd arrived. Kratos spent the rest of the night in meditation, centering himself for the coming meeting. He thought of Atreus, wondering if his son was safe, if he was searching for his father across the realms. He thought of the battles he'd fought, the gods he'd killed, and the long road that had led him from Sparta to Olympus to Midgard to this strange world of political intrigue and ancient magic. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky a pale blue unmarred by clouds. Kratos armed himself fully, Leviathan axe, blades of chaos, the muscle memory of centuries ensuring each weapon sat perfectly balanced. He emerged from Winterfell to find Jon, Arya, Sansa, and Davos waiting, along with an honor guard of northern soldiers who looked decidedly nervous about what was to come. They rode out to the meeting place, a cleared field a mile from Winterfell's walls, where Daenerys Targaryen's forces had made camp. Kratos walked while the others rode, his pace easily matching the horses. As they approached, the scale of the Dragon Queen's power became evident. 20,000 unsullied soldiers stood in perfect formation, their spears gleaming in the morning sun, their discipline absolute. Behind them, the Dothraki riders sat on their horses with the easy confidence of born warriors. And circling overhead, massive and terrible and beautiful, 2 dragons danced through the sky. They were magnificent creatures, Kratos had to admit. One was black with red highlights, its scales seeming to absorb light, its eyes fierce and intelligent. The other was green and bronze, slightly smaller but no less impressive. They moved with the grace of apex predators, and even from this distance, Kratos could feel the heat radiating from them, could sense the ancient magic that burned in their blood. At the center of her army, seated on a throne that had been carried from King's Landing for exactly this purpose, sat Daenerys Targaryen. She was younger than Kratos had expected, perhaps 30 years old, though her eyes held the weariness of someone who had lived through far more than her years suggested. Silver gold hair fell in elaborate braids past her shoulders, and she wore a dress of red and black that managed to be both elegant and practical. But it was her bearing that marked her as different, the way she sat, the tilt of her head, the absolute certainty in her expression. This was a woman who had been told since birth that she was destined for greatness, and who had fought hard enough and sacrificed enough that she believed it. As Kratos' group approached, the dragons descended, landing on either side of Daenerys' throne with ground-shaking impacts. The black one, Dragon, Kratos would learn, turned its massive head to regard him with unmistakable intelligence and what might have been recognition. It knew what he was, even if it didn't understand the details. Knew he was dangerous in ways its mother might not fully appreciate. Jon dismounted and approached with Kratos beside him. The king in the north bowed respectfully. "Your Grace, may I present Kratos, the Ghost of Sparta. Kratos, this is Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the first of her name, Queen of the Andals and the First Men, Protector of the Seven Kingdoms, the Mother of Dragons, the Breaker of Chains." "Enough titles," Daenerys interrupted, her voice carrying across the field with surprising strength. Her eyes, violet, unusual, and striking, fixed on Kratos with intense scrutiny. "I care less about formalities and more about understanding exactly what happened in the far north. You killed the Night King. Alone. Without armies, without dragons, without anything but your weapons and your will." She paused, and something like hurt flickered across her face. "You denied me the chance to prove myself to the north, to show them that I came here to save them, not to conquer them." "I did not come here to serve your political ambitions," Kratos replied bluntly. "I came here by accident, found a threat, and ended it. Your feelings about the matter are irrelevant." A dangerous silence fell over the field. The Unsullied shifted slightly, hands moving toward weapons. The dragons growled, smoke curling from their nostrils, and Daenerys' expression hardened into something cold and imperious. "Irrelevant," she repeated softly. "Do you have any idea what I sacrificed to come north? I left my conquest of King's Landing incomplete. I brought my armies into winter to fight an enemy I had never seen, based on Jon Snow's word alone. I risked everything, my dragons, my people, my destiny, to save a continent that has shown me nothing but treachery and resistance." Her voice rose slightly, passion breaking through the imperial mask. "And you call that irrelevant?" "Yes," Kratos said simply. "Because the people who would have died during your grand rescue do not care about your sacrifices. They only care that they still live. Your need to be seen as a savior is about your pride, not their survival." Daenerys stood abruptly, her face flushing with anger. Drogon roared, the sound shaking the very air, and fire bloomed in his throat. But before things could escalate further, Jon stepped between them, hands raised placatingly. "Please, both of you," he said urgently. "Daenerys, he's not your enemy. He saved countless lives. And Kratos, she's not some power-hungry tyrant. She genuinely cares about the people of Westeros, even if her methods are sometimes complicated." Kratos studied the Dragon Queen more carefully, looking past the anger to what lay beneath. He saw someone young, powerful, and deeply uncertain beneath the mask of imperial confidence. Someone who had built her entire identity around being the destined savior, and who now faced the terrifying prospect that destiny meant nothing in the face of chaos and chance. He had known that feeling, had felt it when he learned that Zeus was his father, that his entire life had been manipulated by gods playing games with mortal lives. The revelation had nearly broken him, had fed his rage for decades afterward. "You are afraid," Kratos said, more gently than before. "Not of me, though you should be. You are afraid that if you are not the prophesied savior, if you are not the one destined to break the wheel and remake the world, then all your suffering meant nothing. All the people you've lost, all the choices you've made were for nothing. Daenerys stared at him, shocked into silence by the observation. Tears formed in her violet eyes, though she blinked them back furiously. I know that fear, Kratos continued. I lived with it for centuries. Let me tell you what I learned. Destiny is a lie that the powerful tell to control the weak. You are not special because some prophecy said so. You are special. You chose to be because you fought and bled and refused to submit. Your worth is not determined by what you were meant to do, but by what you actually do. The tension in the field shifted, anger giving way to something more complex. Daenerys sank back into her throne, her composure cracking slightly. Then what am I supposed to do now? She asked, and for a moment she sounded young and lost. I've spent my entire life preparing to be the one who saves Westeros. If I'm not that, what am I? That, Kratos said, is a question only you can answer, but I suggest you start by asking what you want, not what you think you're supposed to want. The gods I killed spent eternity fulfilling roles they believed were ordained. It made them powerful, but it also made them slaves to their own nature. You have a chance they never had, the chance to choose who you become. Daenerys was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. Finally, she looked up at him with newfound respect. Jon was right about you. You're more than just a warrior. She searched for the word. You're someone who has walked through hell and somehow remained human enough to care about others walking the same path. I am trying to be, Kratos acknowledged. It does not always succeed, but my son taught me that the attempt matters even when it fails. Your son, Daenerys repeated. Jon mentioned you were separated from him, that you seek a way home. She stood again, this time with purpose rather than anger. I cannot offer you prophecy or destiny, Kratos of Sparta, but I can offer you something potentially more valuable, knowledge and resources. My advisors include scholars who have studied the old Valyrian texts, and I have contacts in Asshai who deal with magic that predates the Doom. If there is a way to return you to your world, we will find it. Consider it payment for the debt Westeros owes you, and perhaps, she smiled slightly, an apology for my earlier hostility. Kratos inclined his head. That is acceptable, but understand this. While I search, I will not become entangled in your wars or politics. My purpose here is to return home, not to help you claim your throne. I wouldn't dream of asking, Daenerys said, though something in her tone suggested she was already calculating how having a god-killer in her corner might change the balance of power. But perhaps, while you're here, you might consider offering some training to my soldiers. The Unsullied are skilled, but they've never faced anyone like you. Learning from someone who killed the Night King single-handedly could only improve their capabilities. Kratos considered this. Training warriors was something he knew, something familiar in this strange world, and it would give him purpose while he searched for a way home. Very well, but I train them my way. No complaints when the methods prove harsh. I would expect nothing less, Daenerys replied, and extended her hand in the manner of Westerosi nobility, sealing an agreement. Kratos took it, his massive scarred hand engulfing hers, and something passed between them. Mutual respect born from honest confrontation rather than political maneuvering. As they parted, Jon exhaled in relief. For a moment there, I thought we were going to witness the shortest alliance in Westeros history, followed by the most spectacular battle. It still may come to that, Arya muttered, but she was smiling slightly. But at least now they respect each other. That's more than most political alliances start with. Kratos looked back at the Dragon Queen, who was already issuing orders to her commanders, her imperial mask firmly back in place. He recognized that defense mechanism, the armor of command worn by those who could not afford to show weakness. He had worn it himself for centuries. But beneath it, he had glimpsed something worth protecting. A young woman trying to do good in a world that rewarded cruelty, who had been given power beyond measure and was struggling to wield it wisely. Perhaps, Kratos thought, his time in this world would not be entirely wasted. Perhaps, while he searched for a way home, he could help ensure that Westeros' next great power learned the lessons he had learned the hard way, that strength without wisdom was tyranny, and that the chains we forge for others often become the ones that bind us. The Ghost of Sparta had come to Westeros to kill Winter's king, but perhaps he would leave having taught its future rulers something more valuable than how to fight, how to be strong without becoming monsters. The months that followed the Night King's death brought changes to Westeros that no one could have predicted. Kratos established himself in a Spartan camp outside Winterfell's walls, refusing the comfort of castle quarters. Each dawn, he drilled Daenerys' unsullied soldiers with a brutality that left even their legendary discipline tested. He taught them not the pretty swordwork of Westerosi knights, but the practical violence of Spartan warfare, how to kill efficiently, how to fight when wounded, how to turn any object into a weapon. The Unsullied, accustomed to rigid formations and absolute obedience, learned to think like warriors rather than soldiers, to adapt rather than simply follow orders. Grey Worm, their commander, proved an apt student. The eunuch warrior possessed a core of pure discipline that reminded Kratos of his own Spartan upbringing, and he absorbed the lessons with focused intensity. Within weeks, the Unsullied had transformed from an already formidable force into something that made even northern veterans nervous when they trained. But Kratos' real project was Daenerys herself. The Dragon Queen had initially resisted his offer to train her personally, citing her responsibilities and the impropriety of a queen engaging in common combat training. Kratos had responded by simply asking whether she wanted to rule through the strength of others or stand as a warrior queen in her own right. That question had struck something in her, and the next morning she appeared at his camp in practical leather armor, silver hair bound back, ready to learn. She was not naturally gifted at combat. Years of survival had taught her cunning and political maneuvering, but not the muscle memory and instincts of a trained fighter. But what she lacked in natural talent, she compensated for with determination that bordered on obsession. Every fall, every bruise, every humiliation of being disarmed by an opponent who moved with casual, overwhelming competence only made her more determined to improve. Kratos found himself respecting that quality. It reminded him of his younger self, the mortal Spartan warrior who had clawed his way to prominence through sheer refusal to accept defeat. Again, Kratos commanded as Daenerys picked herself up from the dirt for the 20th time that morning, her practiced sword knocked from her grip by a simple disarm technique. You telegraph your strikes, your shoulders tense before you move. Against a trained opponent, you might as well announce your intentions verbally. "I'm trying," Daenerys gasped, frustration evident in her voice. Sweat plastered hair to her forehead and her arms trembled with exhaustion. "But you move so fast." "I move at normal speed," Kratos interrupted. "You simply think too slowly. Combat is not about conscious thought. It is about training your body to react before your mind can interfere." Again. She retrieved her sword and attacked once more, this time with better form, trying to mask her intentions. Kratos parried effortlessly and swept her legs, sending her sprawling again. But this time, she rolled with the fall and came up already swinging, adapting to the situation rather than accepting defeat. Kratos blocked the strike but nodded approval. "Better. You are learning to think like a fighter, not consciously planning each move but flowing from one action to the next." He helped her to her feet. "Enough for today. You will injure yourself if we continue, and injuries from training stupidly serve no purpose." Daenerys accepted the hand up, breathing hard but managing a tired smile. "You're a harsh teacher." "I am the only kind of teacher worth having," Kratos replied. "Those who coddle their students prepare them for failure. I prepare you for survival." As they walked back toward the camp, Daenerys spoke more quietly. "Why are you doing this? Training me, I mean. You made it clear you want no part of Westeros politics, yet you're investing time in making me a better warrior. What's your purpose?" Kratos was silent for a long moment, considering his answer. "Because I have seen what happens when those with great power have no understanding of violence. They delegate it to others, make decisions about war and death from comfortable positions of ignorance, and inevitably innocent people suffer for their mistakes." He looked at her directly. "You will rule this land, one way or another. The throne you seek will demand violence. Better that you understand personally what you ask of your soldiers, that you know the weight of the blade and the cost of the swing. And you think that will make me a better queen?" "I think it will make you a more honest one," Kratos said, "which is perhaps the best any ruler can hope to be." Their conversations during these training sessions became the foundation of an unlikely friendship. Daenerys told him of her childhood in exile, of cruel older brothers and the constant fear of assassination, of discovering she could command dragons and believing it made her special. Kratos told her fragments of his own history, enough that she understood the weight of the divine curse he carried, the son he had lost to his own rage, and the son he had found too late to undo all the damage he had caused. "Do you think we can escape what we were made to be?" Daenerys asked one evening as they sat by the fire, both exhausted from the day's training. "You were made to be a weapon by your gods. I was made to be a conqueror by my bloodline and my circumstances. Can either of us be anything else?" "I do not know," Kratos admitted, "but my son taught me that the attempt matters, that choosing to try to be better, even when everything in you resists, is itself a form of strength." He stared into the flames, remembering Atreus's face. "He would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated your determination to improve yourself rather than simply relying on your dragons and your destiny." "I would have liked to meet him," Daenerys said softly. "You speak of him with such gentleness. It's strange, seeing that quality in someone who killed the Night King single-handedly." "Fatherhood changes you," Kratos said simply. "Or it should if you let it. My first children I failed utterly. My son now I am trying to do better, but I fear," he trailed off, rare vulnerability showing in his expression. "I fear that I will fail him too in the end. That violence is all I truly understand, and eventually that limitation will destroy everything I care about." Daenerys reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that Kratos accepted without pulling away. "Then we're alike in that fear," she said. "I'm terrified that despite all my talk of breaking wheels and building a better world, I'll just become another tyrant, another mad king, burning those who oppose me and calling it justice." "Then do not become that," Kratos said firmly. "You have a choice every day, every moment." "The gods I killed had no choice. They were bound by their natures, locked into patterns of behavior they could not escape. But you are mortal. Flawed and limited, yes, but also free. Use that freedom wisely." While Kratos trained Daenerys' forces and searched for magical means to return home, the political situation in Westeros continued to evolve. News arrived from King's Landing that Cersei Lannister, the queen who had refused to send aid against the White Walkers, had been deposed by her own people. The small folk, tired of her tyranny and hearing tales of Daenerys' heroism in the north, embellished by bards who cared more for good stories than strict accuracy, had risen in rebellion. Cersei had fled the city, her whereabouts unknown. The Iron Throne sat empty, and the various powers of Westeros looked to the north, where the Mother of Dragons trained with a god-killer and commanded an army that had witnessed the impossible. "They're calling for me," Daenerys told Kratos one morning as they prepared for training. A raven had arrived during the night, bearing messages from multiple lords offering their support if she would march south and claim the throne. "The throne I've wanted my entire life is finally within reach. But you hesitate," Kratos observed. "Why?" "Because of what you said, about being honest, about understanding the weight of what I command." She looked at her hands, calloused now from weeks of weapons training. A month ago, I would have mounted Drogon immediately and flown south to claim what I believed was mine by right. Now I find myself wondering, do I want the throne because it will let me help people, or do I want it because I've been told since birth that it's my destiny? Good, Kratos said simply. That doubt means you are thinking instead of simply reacting. The worst rulers are those who never question their right to rule. But I need to decide, Daenerys said, frustration creeping into her voice. Every day I wait, someone else might claim the throne, or worse, the realm might fracture into civil war again. And I still have responsibilities to my people, the slaves I freed in Essos. They're waiting for me to return to help them build their new societies. Kratos studied her carefully. What does your heart tell you to do? My heart says, Daenerys paused, thinking. My heart says the throne isn't what matters. What matters is whether I can actually help people, whether sitting on an iron chair in King's Landing will let me do more good than I could elsewhere. She looked up at him. Is that naive? Am I abandoning my destiny by thinking that way? You are abandoning someone else's idea of your destiny, Kratos corrected, and embracing the harder task of choosing your own path. There is nothing naive about that. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from Winterfell. A rider approached at full gallop, and even from a distance, Kratos could see the urgency in their movements. As they drew closer, he recognized Arya Stark, her face flushed with exertion and something that looked like excitement. Kratos, she called as she reined in her horse. The three-eyed raven says there's something you need to see, in the Wolfswood where you first arrived. He says, she paused, catching her breath. He says there's a tear forming, like the one that brought you here. He thinks it might be a way home. Kratos felt his heart, that organ he had long since learned to ignore, suddenly hammer in his chest. A way home. A way back to Atreus, to the life he had been torn from. After months of searching, consulting with Daenerys' scholars and the few magical practitioners they could find, could it truly be this simple? When, he demanded. Now or soon. Bran says the tear is unstable, that it might close at any moment. If you're going to use it, you need to move quickly. Kratos was already gathering his weapons, checking that the Leviathan axe sat properly on his back, that the blades of chaos hung secure at his sides. Daenerys watched him prepare with an expression that mixed happiness for him and sadness at his departure. Go, she said firmly. Get back to your son. He needs you more than we do. You have learned well, Kratos said, meeting her eyes. Trust in your training, but more importantly, trust in your judgment. You do not need destiny or prophecy to tell you what is right. You only need the courage to act on what you already know. Daenerys embraced him impulsively, and this time Kratos returned the gesture with something approaching warmth. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything, for saving us, for training us, for reminding me that strength without wisdom is just tyranny. She pulled back, wiping at her eyes. If you ever find your way back to this world, you'll always have allies here. I hope I do not return, Kratos said honestly. Not because I did not come to appreciate certain aspects of your world, but because returning would mean I had lost my son again, and I cannot survive that twice. They gathered horses. Kratos refused to ride but could pace them easily, and raced toward the Wolfswood. Jon Snow joined them, having heard the news, along with Bran in a wagon driven by Hodor. The young three-eyed raven sat motionless, his white eyes rolled back, clearly using his sight to monitor the dimensional tear. It's growing stronger, Bran announced in his eerie monotone. The barriers between worlds are thin there, weakened by your arrival months ago. Something on the other side is reaching through, searching. Someone who knows you. Atreus, Kratos breathed. His son, using his divine heritage and knowledge of the realms, searched for his father. Of course, he would not simply accept Kratos' disappearance. The boy was nothing if determined. They reached the clearing where Kratos had first appeared in this world, and immediately he could feel the wrongness in the air. Reality rippled and distorted, colors bleeding into each other, sounds echoing strangely. And at the center of the clearing, a crack in existence itself pulsed with unstable energy, crimson and gold, the colors of magic from his home realms. Through the crack, Kratos could hear a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Father, I know you're out there. I'm going to bring you home." "Atreus," Kratos roared, his voice carrying across dimensions. "Boy, I am here." The crack widened slightly, and through it, Kratos caught a glimpse of a familiar landscape, Midgard, the forests outside their home, and standing at the center of a massive runic circle, his son. Atreus had grown in the months they'd been separated, looking older, more worn, but still possessing that determined expression that made Kratos' chest ache with pride and fear in equal measure. "Father," Atreus' joy was visible even across dimensions. "I found you. The ritual is working, but the portal won't stay open long. You need to come through now." Kratos stepped toward the tier, but paused at its edge, looking back at the assembled Westerosi. Jon Snow stood with a hand on the sword hilt, ready to defend if something came through with Kratos. Arya watched with her assassin's intensity, analyzing everything. Bran simply stared with those unsettling white eyes, and Daenerys had dismounted from her horse, standing tall despite the tears streaming down her face. "Go," she said again, her voice breaking slightly. "Your son needs you. We'll be fine. We survived for thousands of years before you arrived. We'll survive after you leave." "You will do more than survive," Kratos said with certainty. "You will build something better than what came before. I have seen your determination, your capacity for growth. Trust in that, and you will not become the tyrant you fear." He turned back to the portal, but Jon called out, "Wait, if anyone asks, and they will, what should we tell them about you? About the Ghost of Sparta who killed winter itself?" Kratos considered the question. What was his legacy in this world? What would the songs and stories say about the stranger who had appeared from nowhere, ended the long night in 3 days, then vanished back into legend? "Tell them," he said slowly, "that strength without control is chaos, that power without wisdom is tyranny, and that the greatest warriors are not those who never fall, but those who choose to stand up again, to keep fighting not for glory or destiny, but because someone they love depends on them." He paused, then added more quietly, "Tell them that even monsters can learn to be better if they are given reason to try." "We'll remember," Daenerys promised. "The North remembers, after all, and Westeros will remember the god-killer who saved us and asked for nothing in return but a way home." Kratos nodded once, then turned and stepped toward the portal. The tear in reality reached for him like a living thing, recognizing his essence, drawing him back toward his home world. As he crossed the threshold, he heard Atreus' delighted shout, and felt his son's arms wrap around him in an embrace that made all the months of searching and fighting worthwhile. "I found you," Atreus said, his voice muffled against Kratos' armor. "I told you I would. I used every text in the library, consulted with Freya, and even asked Mimir for help. I wasn't going to stop until I brought you home." "I know, boy," Kratos said gruffly, returning the embrace with a fierceness that surprised even himself. "You are persistent, like your father." Behind them, the portal flickered and began to collapse, the energy maintaining it finally exhausted. Through the shrinking window, Kratos caught one final glimpse of Westeros, of Jon Snow raising his sword in salute, of Arya's faint smile, of Bran's knowing nod, and of Daenerys Targaryen standing tall and strong, no longer seeking destiny but ready to forge her own path. Then the portal closed with a sound like reality sighing in relief, and they were gone. In Winterfell, the story of the Ghost of Sparta would grow into legend. Bards would sing of the warrior from another world who killed the Night King and saved all of Westeros. Scholars would debate whether he had been a god, a demon, or something in between. And in the Red Keep, when Daenerys Targaryen finally claimed the Iron Throne, not through conquest but through election by the lords of Westeros, inspired by her training and her newfound wisdom about the limits of power, she would keep a simple practice sword in her throne room. It was the first blade Kratos had given her for training, worn smooth by months of use, stained with her sweat and blood. And whenever she faced difficult decisions, whenever the weight of the crown threatened to crush her with its demands and temptations, she would hold that sword and remember what the god-killer had taught her. That true strength came not from power over others, but from power over oneself. The Ghost of Sparta's time in Westeros lasted only months, but its impact echoed for generations. Daenerys Targaryen became known as the Warrior Queen, the first monarch in centuries to personally lead troops into battle and to understand viscerally the cost of every command she gave. She abolished slavery throughout the known world and restructured the Seven Kingdoms into a federation of semi-autonomous regions, breaking the wheel of tyranny as she had promised, not through fire and blood, but through the harder work of building consensus and demonstrating strength through restraint rather than destruction. The North prospered under Jon Snow's continued leadership, its bonds with the South strengthened by mutual respect rather than fearful submission. The Night's Watch was reformed into a force dedicated to protecting against threats both natural and supernatural, their ranks filled with volunteers inspired by tales of the stranger who had ended winter itself. And in quiet moments, when the wind howled through the wolfswood and snow fell softly on ancient trees, the people of the North swore they could still feel his presence. The Ghost of Sparta, the god-killer who had walked among them, saved them, taught them, and then returned to his own world without asking for glory or reward. The legend grew that when winter truly threatened again, when darkness rose and hope seemed lost, he would return. That somewhere across the barriers between worlds, the warrior with the scarred skin and burning eyes watched over them still, ready to fight once more if needed. It was a comforting myth, but in the deeper truths that the three-eyed ravens passed down through generations, they knew better. Kratos would not return because he did not need to. His greatest legacy was not the Night King's death, but the lessons he had taught, that strength without wisdom bred only suffering, that power demanded responsibility, and that even those born to violence could choose to be something more. In Midgard, Kratos stood with his son on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over familiar mountains. Atreus peppered him with questions about where he had been, what he had seen, what he had done. And for once, Kratos found himself willing to talk, to share the story of a strange world where dragons were real and winter threatened to swallow everything. "Do you think they'll be okay?" Atreus asked. "The people you left behind." Kratos thought of Daenerys, of her determination and her newfound understanding that destiny was a choice, not a fate. He thought of Jon Snow's quiet strength and Arya's cold competence. He thought of a world that had survived 8,000 years of threats and would undoubtedly survive many more. "They will endure," he said with certainty. "They are stronger than they know. I merely helped them see that strength for themselves." "You did good, father," Atreus said, pride evident in his voice. "You saved a whole world." "I did what needed doing," Kratos replied, but there was warmth in his tone. Nothing more, nothing less. As the stars emerged overhead, different stars than those that shone on Westeros, but no less beautiful, Kratos allowed himself a moment of rare peace. He had been torn from his home, thrust into an impossible situation, forced to fight a battle that was not his own, and he had emerged not just victorious but changed. He had learned that being a warrior did not mean being only a weapon, that strength could protect without dominating, that the measure of a person was not in their power but in how they chose to wield it. Lessons his son had been trying to teach him all along, lessons he was finally beginning to understand. The Ghost of Sparta had walked through Westeros and left it better than he found it, not through conquest or control, but through the simple act of standing against the darkness when no one else could, and then stepping aside to let others forge their own destinies. It was, perhaps, the most heroic thing he had ever done, and for once, Kratos allowed himself to feel something like satisfaction at a battle well fought and a lesson well learned. Somewhere across the barriers between worlds, in a land of ice and fire, dragons roared in the distance, and a queen trained with her blade, determined to be worthy of the ghost who had saved her kingdom, and asked for nothing in return but the chance to go home. And in both worlds the legends grew, of strength tempered by wisdom, of power balanced by restraint, and of the truth that even gods could learn to be better if they were willing to try.